the boardroom was cold by design. Sapharina Valeflame had chosen the temperature herself when she'd had the floor renovated 3 years ago. 17 degrees Celsius precisely, a number her facilities manager had questioned once, and never again. Cold rooms kept people alert. More importantly, they kept people uncomfortable, and discomfort, in her experience, was the only honest negotiating condition. She stood at the head of the table now, one hand resting on the back of her chair, not sitting, and watched the 12 faces arranged before her arrive at the same conclusion at different speeds. The Mercer Group's acquisition proposal, 47 pages, spiral-bound, delivered by a team who had clearly expected to impress her, lay on the table in front of her, unopened. "You've read it," said the man across from her, Geoffrey Mercer. "Our 63 inherited wealth, the particular confidence of someone who had never once had to build anything from the rubble of his own failure." He was not asking. "I received it at 11:47 last night," Sapharina said. "I read it at 12:30. I've had since then to think." "And?" The room waited. "Your valuation of the Ashgrove portfolio is 14% below market projection," she said. "Not a rounding error, a position. Which means this proposal isn't an acquisition offer. It's a test of whether I'm desperate enough to take a discount and call it a partnership." She let the silence develop for exactly 3 seconds. "I'm not." Geoffrey Mercer's expression moved through several stages with admirable control. His legal advisor touched his sleeve once, a small and telling gesture. "Ms. or Valeflame, you have 48 hours to return with corrected figures," she said. "I'll have coffee brought in." The dismissal was absolute. People gathered their things with the specific efficiency of professionals who had been handled by an expert and knew it. Sapharina did not move until the last person had passed through the glass doors. And then she turned to the window, and London spread itself below her in grey January light. And she let herself breathe. The fire in the gas hearth at the far end of the boardroom flared. She hadn't looked at it. She felt it. A sudden upward surge, heat pressing against the back of her neck, the flame jumping a foot above its housing and then settling before anyone still lingering in the doorway could register it as unusual. Sapharina turned slowly and looked at the hearth. The flame sat at its normal height, steady, obedient. Her hands were entirely still. She made certain of that. Eleanor Marrow arrived at the Valeflame Group's private viewing suite at 6:30, carrying the discretion of someone who understood that certain acquisitions did not benefit from public records. She was a careful woman, careful in the specific way of people who have spent years adjacent to things that would unsettle most people's understanding of the world and had learned to carry that adjacency quietly. The piece she had brought was small. That was the first thing Sapharina noticed. She had expected something monumental, given the price Elena had named. And what sat on the velvet display stand was a disc of pale stone, no larger than her palm, carved with a symbol that Sapharina did not recognize and could not stop looking at. "Late dynastic period," Elena said. "Origin unknown, though the carving technique suggests access to tools that shouldn't have existed in that era. It came to us through a private estate in the Cotswolds. The family had owned it for generations without any record of acquisition. They simply always had it." Sapharina leaned forward. The symbol was concentric, a flame rendered in geometric form, each ring slightly offset from the last, giving the impression of motion in a static object. Something about its proportions felt less like design and more like notation, as though the symbol was not decorative but instructive. "What does the family know about its provenance?" "Very little." Eleanor's pause was a fraction too measured. "They described it as a family piece, something passed down." Sapharina reached toward it. "I'd prefer you didn't touch..." Her fingertip made contact with the stone's surface. The temperature dropped, not in the room, in her. A cold clarity moving from her hand to her sternum, and then images arriving not as memory but as physical fact. Marble floors reflecting firelight, the smell of cedar and something older. A woman's voice speaking in a language that did not exist anymore, and underneath all of it a grief so precise and so enormous that Sapharina's next breath came out wrong. She withdrew her hand. Eleanor was watching her with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally alarmed. "I'll take it," Sapharina said. "I hadn't yet named... whatever the figure is. I transfer the paperwork to my acquisitions team by morning." She straightened. Her voice was entirely even. "And Elena, whoever else has expressed interest in this piece, I'd like their names." Elena's carefully maintained expression shifted by a single degree. "That's not typically information I know," Sapharina said. "I'm asking anyway." She arrived home at 9, and the penthouse was exactly as she had left it. Controlled, precise, every surface chosen for its deliberate absence of sentiment. She had built this space the same way she had built everything, from specificity, from will, from the absolute refusal to be comfortable with less than what she had decided she deserved. The fireplace was cold. She had not lit it. The flame inside it was burning. Sapharina crossed the room in measured steps and crouched before the hearth. The fire was small, self-contained, burning on no visible fuel. And in the ash at the fireplace's base, arranged with the precision of intention rather than accident, a name. Theron. She did not know it. She was certain she did not know it. Her hands had begun to shake before she finished being certain. He had learned, over centuries, that the most dangerous thing a man could do was stand still in a doorway. Theron understood thresholds the way most people understood weather, as a condition to be navigated, not questioned. You moved through them, or you did not. Hesitation in a doorway was invitation, and invitation, in his experience, was the first architecture of consequence. He stood in the doorway of the Aldgate Assembly Hall anyway, for 4 seconds longer than he had permitted himself, and then stepped through. The gathering occupied the hall's upper floor, a rotating arrangement of London's supernatural infrastructure that met on the last Thursday of each month beneath the institutional cover of a heritage preservation society. The humans who managed the building's bookings had never questioned the membership list. Certain glamours were old enough to feel like truth. Cassian found him before he'd crossed the room. "You look like a man attending his own funeral," Cassian said, falling into step beside him with the easy familiarity of someone who had been doing precisely this for decades. Which, given the guest list, may be accurate. Who arranged the crossover attendance? Silas Viramont. Officially, it's a professional function. Some development trust Sapharina's company has been approached to fund. Or unofficially, Cassian's pause was brief and deliberate, he wanted them in the same room. Theron said nothing. He accepted a glass from a passing tray and did not drink from it. "She arrived 20 minutes ago," Cassian continued. "Northeast corner, speaking with Octavius Draven, which I find concerning on multiple levels. Octavius is always where interests converge. It means nothing by itself. It means something when the interests include recently moved Phoenix relics and a woman who doesn't yet know what she is." Cassian stopped walking. "Theron, she's waking. The flame signature last night was measurable from across the city. You felt it. I know you felt it. Because you were awake when I arrived this morning and you hadn't slept. I'm aware of what I felt. Then you understand that your policy of managed distance has an expiration." Theron looked across the room. He had allowed himself, across the long accumulation of her incarnations, to look. That was the boundary he had maintained, with something close to religious discipline. He could observe, could position himself at the periphery of her various lives, could ensure that the worst contingencies were managed from a distance. He had never, in any incarnation, permitted more than that. The reasoning was sound, and he had rehearsed it so many times it had worn smooth. His proximity accelerated her memory recovery, and memory recovery without context was destabilization. and destabilization of a waking phoenix carrying incomplete nirvana was a category of catastrophic he refused to risk. The reasoning remained sound. He looked anyway. Sapharina Valeflame stood in the northeast corner of the hall with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had learned to make rooms arrange themselves around them. She was speaking precisely, minimally, with the controlled cadence of someone who measured every word before it left her mouth. Even from this distance, something in her posture communicated a calculation running several layers beneath the visible conversation. Octavius Draven was smiling at something she'd said. The smile did not reach the part of his face where genuine responses lived. And then, as though the room had shifted its acoustic architecture specifically to arrange this, Silas Viramont appeared at Theron's elbow with the practiced warmth of a man who had long ago perfected the art of seeming accidental. "Theron, I had hoped you'd come." A pause that was entirely too comfortable. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." The introduction was brief, social, and constructed with the precision of a mechanism. Sapharina turned from Octavius when Silas spoke her name, and her eyes found Theron with the specific quality of someone encountering a word in a foreign language that they recognize without being able to translate. Not familiarity. Something prior to familiarity. The structural recognition of a shape the mind already held without knowing how it came to hold it. "Sapharina Valeflame," Silas said. "Theron. He's recently relocated. We've been discussing the development trust." "Mr. Theron," she said, and no surname registered on her face as an absence. In this world, people without surnames either had something to hide or something older than surnames to carry. Her eyes noted this and filed it without comment. "Ms. Valeflame." His voice came out leveled, which required more effort than it should have. "I understand your company has been approached regarding the Aldgate Heritage Initiative." "I've been approached regarding a great many things recently," she said. "I'm still determining which of them are what they appear to be." The sentence was professionally anodyne. Something beneath it was not. "A reasonable position," he said, "for someone in your situation." A fractional pause. And what situation would that be? He had walked directly into that, and they both knew it. The corner of her mouth moved by a degree that was not quite a smile. It was the expression of someone who had identified an opponent's quality and was revising their initial assessment upward. "A prominent one," he said, after a beat that was precisely 1 second too long. She looked at him for a moment that lasted considerably longer than the conversation required. Then Silas redirected the exchange with the smoothness of a man who had been doing exactly this for years. And the moment passed, and Theron excused himself with the discipline of someone dismantling a loaded mechanism with bare hands. He made it to the hall's east corridor before Cassian found him. "Well," Cassian said, "don't. I merely observed." "I'm leaving." Theron set down the untouched glass. "Watch Octavius. Whatever he and Silas arranged tonight, it wasn't professional courtship for a development trust." He walked toward the exit with the controlled velocity of a man enforcing a decision before the part of him with better arguments could intervene. Behind him, across the hall, the candles along the northeastern wall extinguished themselves in a single simultaneous breath. In the northeast corner, Sapharina stood very still, looking at the place he had been, her expression unreadable and her pulse doing something she could not explain and refused to examine. The candles did not relight. The document arrived on a Tuesday, routed through 3 intermediary addresses before landing in Sapharina's private server with the specific anonymity of something that had been handled carefully by someone who understood they were handling something dangerous. She almost deleted it. The subject line contained no text. The attachment was a single PDF, 42 pages of academic notation, dense with theoretical framework and historical sourcing, authored by Empire Vane and dated 18 months prior. The header read, Nirvana interruption and the fragmentation of cyclical flame. Origin, a theoretical reconstruction. Sapharina read it standing at her desk, still in her coat, having not yet decided to stay. She stayed for 3 hours. The language was technical, the sourcing meticulous, and the central argument structured with the kind of intellectual precision that required either genuine scholarship or extraordinary access to primary materials that should not exist in any archive she knew of. And Pyrovane's thesis was this, that a phoenix's nirvana, the ignition point of death and rebirth, was not merely biological but cosmological, a moment during which the soul's accumulated fire origin was briefly externalized. At that moment, and only at that moment, the flame was theoretically separable from the being it belonged to. The extraction would require exact timing, a specific ritual apparatus, and the complete suppression of the phoenix's survival instinct in the seconds preceding ignition. The paper described the required ritual components in numbered sequence. Sapharina set the document down. She picked it up again. The components were not theoretical. They were specific. Materials, arrangements, measurements. This was not a scholar reconstructing a historical hypothesis. This was an engineer describing a mechanism that had been built before. She pulled Elena Marrow's contact from her files and sent a single message. The names. Today. Clara Ashford arrived uninvited. This was, Sapharina would later reflect, entirely consistent with everything she subsequently learned about the woman. Clara operated on the journalistic principle that the most valuable information lived precisely where permission had not been granted. She appeared at the Valeflame Group's reception at 2:30 with a press credential for a financial publication that Sapharina's assistant confirmed was legitimate, and a request for comment on the Ashgrove acquisition that Sapharina's instincts confirmed was not the actual reason for the visit. She granted the meeting for 11 minutes. Clara used 4 of them on the Ashgrove questions, which were competent and perfunctory, and then placed a photograph on the desk between them. It was a still from auction footage, a private sale, 18 months ago, in which a carved stone disc changed hands. The buyer's face was partially obscured. The disc was the same one now sitting in Sapharina's acquisitions vault, 2 floors below. I've been tracking the movement of a specific category of artifact through London's private market for 8 months, Clara said. 7 pieces. Different eras, different materials, different stated provenances. 3 things in common. Origin attribution is always unclear. The same 3 intermediary buyers appear somewhere in the acquisition chain, and the funding traces eventually to a development trust associated with Adrian Blackwood. Sapharina looked at the photograph, then at Clara. Why are you bringing this to me? Because 4 days ago, your name appeared as the acquiring party for the 7th piece. Clara's voice was measured, the specific register of someone who had trained themselves to deliver alarming information without inflection. And because I've seen what happens to people who get close to these objects without understanding what they are, I thought a warning was the professional courtesy. You don't know what they are either. No, Clara said, but I know that a flame scholar named Theron has been contracted to study them, and I know his research was funded before he published, which means someone knew what conclusions he would reach before he reached them. After Clara left, Sapharina sat with the photograph for a long time. The stone disc, the acquisition chain, Pyravane's paper describing a ritual mechanism with component specifications that aligned, she now understood, with 7 artifacts currently being consolidated in London, 6 of which were not in her vault. The memory arrived without warning, as they always did. Not summoned but detonated, her body's response preceding her mind's comprehension. She was standing at the window, watching the city when the smell reached her, cedar and old stone and something beneath both that had no name in any language she currently possessed. The marble floor, the firelight, the woman's voice from the vision in Eleanor's suite, now with more context around it, a temple, vast and warm, and Sapharina moving through it with the particular authority of someone who belonged to a place completely. And then, the ambush. Not sequential, simultaneous, the way traumatic memory restructures time. The temple and the attack occupying the same moment, the before and the violence collapsed into a single image, a figure above her. The specific quality of cold that was not temperature but absence, the flame origin being drawn outward against her will in the moments before. She came back to herself, gripping the window ledge with both hands, the glass before her fogged with heat that had not come from the building's systems. The figure in the memory had no face she could recover, but she had seen his hands, and the ring on his left hand, a seal she did not yet have a name for, was specific enough to draw. She drew it from memory, and on the back of Clara's photograph. Then she opened her laptop and searched the Valeflame Group's building records, acquisition history, prior tenants, original construction permits. It took 40 minutes of cross-referencing before she found it in the Foundation's survey commissioned during her renovation 3 years ago, noted as a pre-existing structural feature of unknown purpose, photographed once and filed without follow-up. In the photograph of the building's lowest sub-level, carved into the original stone of the foundation wall, was the symbol from the disc in her vault. The building had been prepared before she bought it, before she built the company that bought it, before she arrived in London at all. Her phone lit with Elena Marrow's response. The other interested parties, I'm sending 3 names. Please understand that by giving you these, I am making a choice I cannot reverse. Be careful with what you do with it. The 3rd name on the list was Silas Viramont. Alexander did not announce himself. He was simply present, the way certain forces are present, not arriving so much as becoming visible, as though he had always occupied the corner of the room, and the room had only now decided to acknowledge it. Sapharina looked up from the Foundation's survey spread across her desk and found him standing at the edge of her office's sitting area, unhurried, his hands loose at his sides, wearing the specific stillness of someone who had long ago stopped needing to perform composure because the genuine article had simply become his resting state. He was not young. He was also not old in any way her eyes could precisely measure. There was something in the architecture of his face that suggested duration rather than age, the way certain buildings communicate their centuries, not through visible decay, but through an authority of proportion that newer structures simply do not carry. The security on this floor is genuinely impressive, he said, by way of explanation. I want you to know, I noted it carefully before I rendered it temporarily inoperative. Sapharina's hand had moved to the letter opener on her desk before she consciously decided to reach for it. She registered this and set it down. That's an unusual introduction. I find unusual introductions tend to communicate more efficiently than conventional ones. He looked at the Foundation's survey without touching it, his eyes moving across it with the recognition of someone reading a familiar text. You found the carving. You know what it is. I know what it was used for. He looked up. Which is a more troubling piece of information. May I sit? She gestured toward the chair across from her. He sat with the ease of someone accustomed to rooms that did not belong to him. His name, when he gave it, produced no external response from her. Internally, something shifted. Not recognition, but the structural awareness that this name had weight in registers she could not yet consciously access. She filed this and continued. You said you know what I am, she said, before I did. I'd like to understand the timeline of that knowledge. Approximately 970 years, Alexander said without apology. Or give or take the decades when you were between incarnations and therefore somewhat difficult to track. The office was very quiet. Outside, London conducted its ordinary evening. And in those 970 years, Sapharina said, with the particular evenness she reserved for conversations that required absolute control, you observed. You tracked. You did not, at any point, find it useful to provide information that might have protected you. Something moved through his expression. Not guilt, precisely, but its older, more complicated relative. I considered it, in several incarnations. Each time the calculation resolved the same way. A phoenix waking without context is dangerous. A phoenix waking into a prepared narrative, provided by someone with their own history and their own failures and their own considerable interest in the outcome. That is worse. He looked at her steadily. I elected to let you build your understanding from your own materials. I'm here now because the timeline has changed. Changed how? The ritual components are almost entirely consolidated. You have one. The other 6 are within a single controlled network's reach. And that network has been moving faster in the past 3 weeks than in the past 3 years. He paused. Someone inside your circle accelerated the timeline, which means someone inside your circle received a signal that your awakening had reached a threshold that made waiting dangerous. Sapharina was quiet for a moment. What does the ritual do? Precisely, Alexander told her. Did he use the same language Pyravane's paper had used, but with the additions that primary knowledge provides? Not theory, but testimony, the account of someone who had been present for the original event and had carried the specific weight of that witnessing for 1,000 years. When he finished, the room held a quality of silence that was different from the silence before. The fragment, she said finally. The piece of my soul that the interruption separated. Where is it? That, Alexander said with the first register of something that was not composure, is the question I have been unable to answer for a century. It is held somewhere in the ritual architecture. If the mechanism is completed against you again, it returns to the apparatus permanently. You survive, you continue, you are simply smaller, or less. He looked at her with the directness of someone who understood that softening this would be its own category of harm. The people who designed the original ritual considered that the more elegant solution. Death would have made you a martyr. Diminishment makes you manageable. The door opened. Theron stopped in the doorway. The quality of his stillness was entirely different from Alexander's, where Alexander's composure was architectural, something constructed over centuries into a permanent feature. Theron's stillness in this moment was the stillness of a man exerting considerable force against his own forward momentum. His eyes moved from Alexander to Sapharina and back, with an assessment that took less than 2 seconds and clearly arrived at conclusions he found entirely unwelcome. Cassian said you had an unscheduled visitor, he said, to no one and both of them simultaneously. Mr. Theron. Alexander's tone was perfectly calibrated, not warm, not hostile, the register of 2 people who had a long and complicated history and had both survived long enough to manage it. You look as though you've slept poorly. I look, Theron said, stepping into the room and not toward Alexander, as though I arrived to find a situation I would have preferred to prevent. Which situation, specifically? Theron did not answer. He looked at Sapharina instead, and something in his expression shifted into a register she had not seen from him before. Not the careful social restraint of the assembly hall, not the managed distance that she had catalogued and quietly found insufficient. This was something prior to management, something that had not yet been revised into acceptability. Are you all right? He said. Not a social question, an actual one. The directness of it required a moment to absorb. Yes, she said. He's been useful. He is also, Theron said, with the precision of someone choosing each word with full awareness of its weight. Not a disinterested party. Whatever he's told you tonight, it is true. It is also incomplete in ways that serve his particular preferred resolution. He looked at Alexander. Tell her the rest. Or I will. Alexander studied him for a long moment. Then, with something that might have been respect, if it had not also contained the complexity of 1,000 years of mutual understanding, The fragment of her soul. I know where it is because I can feel it. The phoenix fire recognizes its own origin. A pause that held considerable weight. It has been held, since the night of the ritual, inside the flame signature of the wizard who was present at her death and survived. He met Sapharina's eyes. The person carrying the missing piece of you, Sapharina, without knowing it, is Theron. The fire in the office hearth did not flare. It went entirely, absolutely still. She did not confront Silas immediately. This was, she understood, the part of herself that was still the Iron Lady. The part that had learned, through years of building something from nothing in rooms full of people who expected her to fail, that the most dangerous thing you could do with intelligence was deploy it before it was complete. Sapharina had found Silas's name on Elena's list on a Tuesday. By Friday, she had built a case from materials he did not know she possessed. She did it quietly. She did it alone. She did not tell Theron. That last decision she examined and made deliberately, which was the only honest way to make it. The revelation in her office 4 nights ago, Alexander's voice, the stillness of the fire, the specific quality of Theron's expression when the words landed, had rearranged something in the architecture of her understanding that she had not yet finished surveying. That a fragment of her soul had travelled through 1,000 years inside the flame signature of a man she had met 3 weeks ago was not information she could process while simultaneously dismantling a betrayal. She had compartmentalized it with the precision she applied to everything that mattered too much to approach directly. And she had gone to work. The evidence was not dramatic. It never was in her experience. The most devastating betrayals were always built from small, ordinary materials. An introduction arranged with too much precision. Meeting notes from the Supernatural Council, forwarded to an address that, traced through 4 routing layers, resolved to a server registered to one of Adrian Blackwood's subsidiary holdings. A keycard access log showing Silas had been in the sub-level of her building, the level with the foundation carving, twice in the past 6 months, both times during periods when she was travelling and the building's executive security was operating on reduced protocol. And the acquisition paperwork, the original acquisition of the building 8 years ago, before she had the capital to purchase it herself, handled through a property trust whose beneficial ownership, buried under 3 corporate layers, included a name that appeared nowhere in the public record, but appeared twice in Pyravane's research acknowledgements. Silas had not built the mechanism, he had maintained it, kept it warm, kept it waiting. She called him into her office on a Friday afternoon with a fabricated agenda item about the development trust, and she watched him cross the room toward her with the ease of a man who believed himself safe. And she felt, for a precise and terrible moment, nothing at all. Then she set the documents on the desk between them. His face did something complicated. Not guilt. Guilt was a response to being caught. And what moved through Silas Viramont's expression was older and more painful than that. It was the face of a man arriving at a reckoning he had been constructing arguments against for years and had always known, in the part of himself that remained honest, he would eventually lose. Sapharina, don't. Her voice was level. The temperature in the room was not. Don't navigate this. Just tell me whether any of it was genuine. A long silence. All of it was genuine, he said. That's the part I couldn't resolve. The attachment was real. The care was real. I told myself, for a long time, that genuine care made the rest of it acceptable. He looked at the documents. I was wrong. I knew I was wrong before I finished telling myself I wasn't. Who gave you the original assignment? Octavius, 12 years ago. Before you arrived in London, he knew you were coming, knew the incarnation cycle had been tracking the flame signature for decades. I was supposed to be positioned in your circle when you built one. A pause. I didn't expect to... He stopped. Finish the sentence. I didn't expect to find you as you are. He looked at her with the full weight of 12 years of something complicated and real and catastrophically misaligned. I didn't expect it to matter, and then it did, and I continued anyway. And I am aware that the sincerity of my regret is not a thing you are obligated to receive. Sapharina looked at him for a long moment. Then the fire came. Not violence. Not destruction. It rose from her in a wave of heat and light that filled the room from floor to ceiling, every surface illuminated, every shadow eliminated. So the fire finding the walls and the ceiling and the glass and holding there, a sphere of absolute flame that consumed nothing because it was not that kind of fire. It was the fire of a being whose origin was primordial and whose anger had finally exceeded the architecture of her control. In the light of it, she saw Silas clearly. She saw the room clearly. And in the incandescent periphery of her own vision, she saw something else. A fragment of memory arriving not in pieces but complete, the full sequence finally surrendering to the pressure of 1,000 years of accumulated need. The temple. The ambush. The figure with the seal ring. The specific cold of her flame being drawn outward in the moments before her death, and the face of the child she had been carrying, which she had never in any prior incarnation recovered, arriving now with the precision of a wound that had always been there and had never been named. And Theron, his face at the moment of the ambush, not the controlled, managed face of the man she had met 3 weeks ago, but something underneath it. The same face stripped to its absolute foundation. A man who would have burned the world and considered it a reasonable trade. She came back to herself. The fire receded. Silas was still in the chair, unharmed, his expression carrying the specific quality of someone who had just witnessed something that had rearranged their understanding of what they had been working against. "Leave London," she said. "Tonight. Don't contact Octavius. Don't contact Blackwood. If I find that you have—" She stopped. "I won't be this composed a second time." After he left, she sat for a long time in the silence. Then she picked up her phone and called Theron. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had been awake, which meant he had been waiting, and she did not examine what it meant that she found this neither surprising nor unwelcome. "I need to speak with you," she said. "Not professionally, not carefully." A pause that cost her something she had been hoarding for a long time. "I remember the temple." On the other end of the line, she heard the sound of a man's careful architecture sustaining a fracture. It had been sustaining for 1,000 years, and finally, beginning to give. "I'll come to you," he said. He arrived at her penthouse at 10:30, and she opened the door before he knocked. She had heard him in the elevator, not the sound of it, but the specific quality of warmth that preceded him, the flame signature she was only now learning to read as distinct from the ambient heat of a building, a city, a world full of ordinary fires. It was, she understood, the same way he had always known where she was. The fragment of her origin flame, carried inside him for 1,000 years without either of them knowing, had been orienting toward her the way a compass needle orients toward north, not by choice, not by decision, but by the irreducible logic of what it was. She stepped back from the door. He came in. They did not speak immediately. This was not awkwardness. It was the specific silence of two people who had been conducting an entire second conversation beneath every exchange they had managed since the assembly hall, and who had arrived finally, and at a moment where the surface conversation was no longer sufficient cover for what lived underneath it. Theron stood in the centre of her living room and looked at her with an expression she now had the memory to read. She had seen it before. On a different face, in a different century, on a man who had stood between her and an ambush and known in the final moments that he was not going to be enough. "I owe you an accounting," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "You were ambushed. You were betrayed." You spent 1,000 years in a slumber that kept your mind awake while your body was frozen, and you woke into a world that had moved without you. And you have spent 20 years managing the consequences of a wound that was never your fault. She looked at him steadily. The only thing I want from you is the truth of what you remember, not the curated version, not the version you've revised for your own protection. A long silence. If I give you the unrevised version, he said, I cannot guarantee my composure for the duration of it. I'm not asking for your composure. He sat down. Not with the careful economy of a man managing a performance, but with the weight of someone who had been holding something for a very long time and had been given, for the first time, a surface to set it on, he told her. The account took 40 minutes, and she listened to all of it without interruption. The 1,000 years of awareness inside the slumber, in the specific torture of watching her incarnations move through their lives from a distance he had enforced with the precision of someone who understood that his own grief was a weapon that could be turned against her. The incarnations where he had come close. The one, 4 centuries ago, where he had spoken to her and spent the following decade dismantling the consequences of that decision because she had been too near her awakening threshold and his proximity had accelerated a recovery she had not been prepared for. The 20 years since the slumber ended, positioning himself at the periphery of London's supernatural infrastructure, maintaining the distance, telling himself it was protection. And the fragment, Sapharina said when he finished. You didn't know. I knew something persisted in my flame signature that I couldn't account for. His voice was level, but beneath the levelness was something that had been under pressure for a very long time. I attributed it to the bond, to residual origin flame from the years we spent together before. I did not. He stopped. I should have known. 1,000 years is sufficient time to perform a more rigorous analysis of your own magical architecture, and I did not because I was afraid of what a rigorous analysis would find. What were you afraid it would tell you? That I had been carrying something of yours all this time, he said, and had not been worthy of it. The room held this for a moment. Theron. She said his name with the specific weight of someone using a word they have been turning over in private for weeks, testing its edges, learning its actual shape. You were ambushed. You did not fail me. You were betrayed by someone you trusted, and you paid for it with centuries, and I will not allow you to carry the framing of a man who abandoned his post when the truth is that you were cut down at it. Something in his face shifted, slowly, like a structure adjusting to the removal of a load it had been built to support. I am still afraid, he said quietly, of what I become when I stop holding myself back, the full capacity of what I am, without restraint. I have seen what it looks like from the inside, during the slumber, in the years when the rage had no outlet and nowhere to go. I am not certain that is something you should be adjacent to. I am a primordial fire origin, carrying 1,000 years of interrupted grief and an incomplete soul, Sapharina said, and I nearly immolated my own office this afternoon. I think we have established that neither of us is the safer option. A sound escaped him that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same space, brief, involuntary, the specific release of someone who has been serious for so long that an unexpected moment of recognition catches them entirely unprepared. Then his phone lit with Cassian's name, and he answered it, and Cassian's voice came through with the clipped efficiency of a man delivering information he wishes he did not have. The Mage Council had convened an emergency session, and Octavius Draven had moved the ritual components to a consolidated location, not Blackwood's network, not the sub-level of her building. A site that had been prepared for decades in the foundations of a Southwark building that the Council's public records listed as administrative offices. Daniel Rowe's department had been called to the same address 20 minutes ago, responding to a reported structural incident. He was already inside. Vaemir, the Ashen Judge, had been sighted at the Thames embankment at dusk, standing at the waterline, looking inland, unmoving. 3 separate supernatural observers had reported it before Cassian correlated the accounts. The judge did not appear for political disputes or personal vendettas. It appeared when flame law was approaching a violation of cosmic scale. Sapharina was already standing, or already moving toward the door. When Theron said her name, she turned. He was on his feet, and the restraint he had been carrying for 20 years, for 1,000 years, in its true accounting, was still present in his bearing, still visible in the set of his jaw and the deliberate control of his hands. But something beneath it had changed, the way a foundation changes when the decision to build on it has finally, irrevocably, been made. "When this is finished," he said, with the measured cadence of a man choosing words that will not unsay themselves, "I would like to stop managing my distance from you, if that is a conversation you are willing to have." She looked at him across the room. This man who had carried a piece of her without knowing it for 1,000 years and had spent that time believing he was unworthy of the weight. "Please ask me again," she said, "when we've earned the quiet to answer it properly." She opened the door. They went. The Southwark building had no name on its exterior, just a number and a heritage preservation plaque that listed a founding date of 1887 and an administrative purpose vague enough to mean anything. From the street, it was unremarkable. 5 stories of Victorian brick, maintained with the specific neutrality of a structure that wanted not to be looked at directly. Below its foundations, something very old was breathing. Sapharina felt it before they reached the door, a pressure against her sternum, rhythmic and deliberate, like a second heartbeat running slightly out of phase with her own. The ritual components, consolidated in one location for the first time in 1,000 years, were generating a resonance that her origin flame recognized the way a tuning fork recognizes its own frequency. Not attraction. Warning. Cassian was already at the perimeter, having arrived 20 minutes ahead of them with the focused efficiency of a man who treated preparation as a moral obligation. He met them at the service entrance with a blueprint and a specific expression. "Row is on the 2nd floor," he said. He responded to a reported gas leak, entirely fabricated, presumably to get a human witness inside the building before the ritual activated, which suggests Octavius wants a record of whatever happens here that exists outside supernatural channels. He paused. "Darius Coldmere has 3 contractors stationed on the ground floor. Nyarus Valen is in the sub-level, and Octavius is already below." "Alexander?" Theron said. "Not accounted for." Sapharina studied the blueprint. The sub-level layout showed a central chamber that had not appeared in any public architectural record, built into the original foundation, which meant it predated the building above it by centuries. The chamber's geometry was not accidental. It was the same concentric configuration as the symbol on the stone disc, as the carving in her own building's foundation. A design she now understood was not decorative notation, but functional architecture, the physical arrangement required to focus the ritual's extraction at the precise moment of nirvana ignition. "They'll need to trigger my death cycle to activate the extraction," she said. "The ritual is useless without it, which means they need me in the chamber, and they need me dying." "Which means," Cassian said, "or walking in is necessary," she said, "because Daniel Rowe is already inside and does not know what is in the building with him, and because the ritual components assembled in that chamber represent the only consolidation that has occurred in 1,000 years, and because if we withdraw tonight, Octavius disperses them again, and we spend the next decade finding them one by one while he prepares a better secured attempt." She folded the blueprint. "We end this tonight. On our terms, not his." Theron had been quiet throughout this exchange with the quality of a man who had already done his arguing internally and arrived at a position. He looked at her now with an expression that was not approval. It was something more honest than approval. The recognition of someone seeing another person clearly and finding nothing in that clarity to flinch from. Then we go in with a defined objective, he said. Row out first. Nyarys separated from Octavius. Her prophecies are his primary intelligence, and incomplete prophecy is more dangerous than silence. The components. He looked at Sapharina. You can feel them. Yes. Can you disrupt the resonance without entering the chamber? She considered this honestly. No. I need to be inside the configuration to address it. The origin flame responds to proximity. At a distance, I can feel it. Inside the geometry, I can answer it. A pause. Then I go in ahead of you. Theron. Not to protect you, he said, with the precision of a man who understood exactly which argument she was prepared to make and was declining to give her the opening for it. To clear the ground. There is a difference between protection and preparation, and I am asking you to allow me the latter. She looked at him. He looked back. The specific negotiation of two people who understood each other's operational logic and were working out the terms of a genuine partnership in real time, under conditions that did not permit the luxury of full deliberation. You have until I reach the sub-level, she said. The ground floor resolved quickly and badly. Coldmere's contractors were professionals, competent, positioned well, operating with the disciplined efficiency of people who had been paid enough to not ask questions. Or what they had not been briefed on was Theron operating without his customary restraint. And the difference between the man who had stood in the assembly hall managing his distance and the archmage who had spent 1,000 years with a grief that had never been processed was not subtle. The fire he used was controlled. It was also absolute. The contractors were not harmed. Theron's flame, like Sapharina's, responded to moral truth, and he was not here for casualties. But they were thoroughly removed from the equation, and the corridors were clear by the time Cassian extracted a bewildered Daniel Rowe from the second floor and redirected him toward the exit with a fabricated explanation that Rowe clearly did not entirely believe and was professionally sensible enough to accept for the moment. Sapharina descended to the sub-level alone. Well, this was not the plan. The plan had involved Theron beside her, Cassian on the upper floors, a coordinated approach to a known configuration. What altered the plan was Alexander, who appeared at the sub-level entrance as she reached it, not as an obstacle, but as a man who had made a decision and was here to implement it. Nyarys is secured, he said. I found her in the antechamber. She was not entirely willing to be a participant in this. Octavius has been feeding her selective context for years. She gave me the full ritual sequence in exchange for removal. He paused. There is a component of the extraction mechanism I did not tell you about in your office. I withheld it because at the time I was uncertain whether telling you would cause you to make a decision I couldn't support. Tell me now. The fragment of your soul, the piece held in Theron's flame signature, cannot be restored to you by the ritual. The ritual would only permanently sever it. He met her eyes. The restoration requires voluntary transfer. Theron must release it consciously, at the moment of your nirvana ignition, which means he must be present at the precise moment the ritual was designed to kill you, and he must choose to give back what he has been carrying, rather than use it to pull you back from the ignition threshold. A pause waited with 1,000 years of specificity. The last time he was in that position, he was ambushed before he could act. Octavius knows this. The chamber is configured to replicate those conditions. The door to the central chamber opened from the inside. Octavius Dreven stood in the threshold, and behind him the chamber burned with the cold light of 7 assembled components, and his expression carried the particular quality of a man who had been patient for a very long time and had finally arrived at the moment he had built his patience for. Sapharina, he said. "I had hoped you'd come yourself. It saves considerable time." From somewhere above her in the building, she felt Theron's flame signature shift. The moment he understood where she was, what she was facing, and what it would cost him to reach her in time. She stepped through the door. The reckoning begins.